תודה רבה למר יוחנן צורף. הדוברת השנייה שלנו היא דוקטור ברנדטה ברטי, עמיתת מחקר במכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי, כאן, עמיתת קרייטמן בבן גוריון, עמיתה בטד, ומומחית לביטחון אנושי, שחקנים לא מדינתיים, חצי מדינתיים, עסקה רבות בחיזבאללה וחמאס, בזירה הבינלאומית. היום היא תשוחח על הזירה הבינלאומית, מגמות ושינויים בהתייחסות לסכסוך בישראל. בבקשה.
בוקר טוב. זה השם שלי, אם אתם לא יודעים. טוב, אז אני אדבר על איך זה נראה מהחוצה, ובגלל שאני אדבר על איך זה נראה מהחוצה, נראה לי שאני הולכת לעשות את זה באנגלית. To change the theme a little bit, to keep your attention up and to make my life a little bit easier. So let me start by saying that I'm going to take a step back and look at how does the question of Palestine, how it would be called in New York or in Brussels, how is it seen today? Let's start with the question number one. Does it still matter? Is it still up there, the agenda? And I think we have to start by deconstructing the question, because if you take a look at how the international media covered the last round of war between Hamas and Israel, then there's no question that Palestine, the Palestinian question, the Palestinians are still very high up on the agenda. At the same time, while Gaza was under war, there were a lot of other conflicts going on in the world that didn't receive the same level of attention. So if you talk about the international media, yes, the question of Palestine is still up there. But if you take it one step back and you start looking at how do the different governments from Washington to Brussels, how do they feel about this question, then I can say the general mood is definitely one of growing frustration. There is different levels of frustration for different reasons that I will address with respect to the PA and with respect to the Israeli government. So I would say it's a generalized frustration. And one of the things we like to focus on when we look at public opinion is that, especially in Europe, you have a growing segment of the European public opinion that identifies with the Palestinian side. That's not a new trend. The really new trend that we're missing is that there's a growing sector of the European population that says, I don't identify with Israelis and I don't identify with the Palestinians. I've simply had enough of both of them. And that actually is the story of the last war. That is the growing trend that I don't think we see enough. So the first mood is frustration. There's frustration with lack of progress, and there is a general disillusionment with the respect of reaching an agreement anytime soon. So that's the context. There is also a context in which, if you look at it from Brussels, yes, Palestine continues to be important, but seen from Brussels, the bigger news is Crimea. The bigger news is the rise of Russia. If you see it from Washington, the bigger news these days is Iraq breaking down to pieces, the rise of ISIS, and the general instability in the Middle East. So yes, the question is there, but it's no longer, I would say, it doesn't topple the Middle East agenda. With that said, if we look at not just what these governments say, but where they put their money, which I think is always a good way to think whether people care or not, then Palestinian politics and Palestine has not been forgotten. The PA receives about between 2 and 2.5 billion a year. The biggest donor continues to be the United States, which gives about 600 million. The budget has not been cut down. Second to the United States is the European Union, which gives about $330 million a year. The budget has not been cut, has risen. So that tells you that it's still very high on the agenda. The third biggest donor in UNRWA, which is itself a pool of contribution from mostly Western government, but growingly also from the rest of the region. So yes, it matters. If you look at where the money goes, Palestine is still very much an economic priority, still the first recipient of international development assistance from the EU. Why is this interesting? Because in the past few years, the European Union has been talking a lot about democracy promotion as their priority. But if you look at where the money is being spent, it's mostly Morocco, Jordan, and Palestine, which I would say are not countries undergoing a democratization process, with all due respect to them. So yes, it matters economically, it matters politically, and I argue that in the past few weeks we'll see with the new High Representative for the EU, Federica Mogherini, coming as her first official visit after she's been appointed as High Representative. She's coming in a few days to Israel and Palestine. We'll see the EU trying to relaunch their presence, relaunch their political agenda in this part of the world. The slogan here is clear. The EU is tired of being just a payer and not a player. So they're going to start doing something about it. At the end of this 20 minutes, I'm going to say that probably it's not going to matter that much, but they're going to try. So I'm giving you the conclusion, wait up. So yes, there is frustration. The money is still being spent. So what are the new trends? What is happening that it's interesting in this aspect? I would start with one trend that I think is very important, and that is that there is, with the general sense that nothing is going to get done in the Israeli-Palestinian front between Abu and the Israeli government, and this perception is stronger after the last elections for reasons I don't have to explain. So because of that, there is a growing investment in Gaza, and Gaza is going to be very much determining the agenda of the international community in the past few months. Now, with the last war, let me take a step back and tell you why Gaza has been up high on the agenda, what has been done, and what the problems are. And I think this is going to be the challenge for the international community. So when the last war ended, the international community, and I'm thinking mostly at the main donors from Brussels and Washington, mostly thought of the Gaza Strip as a new window of opportunity to actually, for once, have a positive impact on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The reason is, and if you read between the lines, the statements were clear. There was a humanitarian challenge, which has been addressed before, and a priority to rebuild Gaza, but along with it, there was the idea that if you do it right, this may be a way to strengthen the Palestinian economy, to encourage reconciliation, and ultimately to get the PA to take back some control in Gaza away from Hamas. So that was the vision. And if you want to say, and the vision was basically backed by two reasons, a political one and a humanitarian one. Humanitarianly, the Gaza Strip after 2014 is definitely a humanitarian priority. That's not news for any of you who have been following the conflict. It's also not a news for you that every few years the EU and the regional players need to come together and rebuild Gaza after it's been destroyed. So because of that, there is a growing frustration with having to do this every 2 or 3 years, and the idea that maybe we can actually get involved politically so we won't have to have another donor conference in 3 years and rebuild Gaza for the gazillion time, which is what's happening. So humanitarian, there was a need. Gaza had been heavily devastated by the last round of war. Virtually every aspect of the infrastructure has been damaged, from the transportation infrastructure to the health care, to water, sanitation, hygiene, shelter. You know that there's about 20,000 people left with no 20,000 house buildings being destroyed, and about 100,000 people left with no home. So I don't have to explain to you why, in deciding where to allocate humanitarian funds, Gaza, from a humanitarian perspective, came first. But that's not just the old story. The bigger story is that the idea was that because Hamas entered in this war in a state of financial need, and indeed this state of financial need can explain in part the last round of war, then the idea is, with this humanitarian aid, we can use it as a bargaining tool to get Hamas to agree to the re-entering of the PA. So there was a political plan behind this. And if you want to get a proof of this, you have to read the statements that were passed in this October 2014, when the Norwegians and the Egyptians organized the big donor conference, the Cairo conference. You might have heard about it because in the media this became the big story of about 5.4 billion allocated to Gaza. That was actually not correct. The 5.4 billion pledges means commitment to give money, not money. I'll get to that in a second. There's a lot of pledges, not a lot of actual money. But of this 5.4 billion allocated to Gaza, actually only half of that was for Gaza. The rest was for the PA and to be spent in the West Bank. So already the budget is half of what most of the news said. It's still a big budget. It's less than what the PA had asked, but it's still a big pool of funds. The biggest pledges this time around came not from the EU, not from the US, but came from the region. Qatar pledged 1 billion, Saudi Arabia pledged 500 million, and the UAE pledged 200 millions. Qatar is the one that's spending the most today out of these three players. The vision in Cairo was clear. The money is going to be paid through the Palestinian single treasury account, which means the money is going to be given through the funding system that funds the PA, and then the PA is going to spend it in Gaza. So what's the political agenda here is that give the PA the leverage to enter back into Gaza. If you read the Cairo document, it says eventually the PA will get back in the crossings, something that Hamas had agreed to during the war. Eventually the PA will take over all the customs authority, which will be a little bit trickier. And the really tricky part, there will be a reform of the civil service system. That's something that has more to do with domestic politics, but let me tell you, that is the sticky point. The PA wants its 70,000 workers that have been sent home after 2007. He wants to see them reintegrated in the government in Gaza. Hamas has put in place of these 70,000 workers, 40,000 of its own workers, and this is the biggest negotiation hurdle. They both want to protect their own workers. Hamas wants its workers paid, and the PA wants the Hamas workers going home and be replaced with the 70,000 that were there before 2007. The international community is passively looking at this and seeing that it's basically one of the biggest hurdles why things are not going the way they should. So there was this whole vision. How is it going on? Has it come to fruition? Now it's May. October was a long time ago. According to the plan, we should have had a substantial chunk of Gaza rebuilt and the PA reinstated. None of that has happened, I would say. And I would tell you what the three main problems are and then move on to what the international community is trying to do about it. Problem number one, there's too little money. 5% of the actual money has actually arrived. 5% of those big pledges. Some of it is here, meaning is in Ramallah, and it's not being channeled to Gaza, but most of it is simply has not been given. So there's a lack of money. Just to give you a snapshot, UNRWA at the end of January actually came out saying we run out of money to pay rental subsidies. So we have families who need this money to continue to rent their apartment. We don't have any more money. Some more funding has been given since then, but of the 720 million they need for their shelter program, they have about 135 million. So not a lot has been done because there's not enough money. Two, there's not enough material going around. I think we'll hear this all over the day, so I'm not going to emphasize it too much for now, but just in parentheses, yes, construction material is going into Gaza. Yes, it's going for international organizations. It's going for the Palestinian Water Authority, and now it's going for the private sector. But the actual amount of material that has gotten to the private sector between August and April is about 10% of what's needed. So there's not enough money. There's not enough material. You understand why that's the case. It's because there is a complicated coordination system between the UN, Israel, and the PA to make sure that none of this material goes into building tunnels or doing other sort of, let's say, mischievous business. But from the international community perspective, the result is Gaza is not being rebuilt at the pace that it's needed to reverse the trend of economic crisis. So that's definitely a big problem. And then we get to the third big stumbling blocks. It's not just about not enough money. It's not just about not enough material. It's also about the PA. The PA is one of the big problems here in terms of bottlenecks. Not a popular thing to say, but if you talk to many of the international donors in the past 3 to 4 months, one of the things you will hear more and more is we're getting tired of having to push Ramallah to want to do more in Gaza. And we're getting tired of Ramallah using Gaza as a political tool. So not doing enough in Gaza with the strategic idea of using this to weaken Hamas. So there is growing frustration. There is growing talks, especially from European donors, about putting more pressure on the PA. But here, if you are in the international community, if you stand in Brussels, there is a big problem. On the one hand, you need reconstruction because you know that without reconstruction, things are going to go sour. There is going to be another war. So to have reconstruction, you need to push the PA to work with Hamas. There's no other way. But at the same time, if you're standing in Brussels, you also support a two-state solution, and you know there is no alternative to the PA, and you know that the PA is ailing, it's weakening, and you don't want to push it too hard because you don't want Hamas to become on the winning side of this. So they are a little bit in a pickle. It's well known. How are they trying to fix this? By brokering a bigger deal, and that's what has been said before. Today, there is not just from the Palestinian discourse, but also from the international players, the big new policy investment will be on brokering an agreement between Hamas and Israel, and then pushing Fatah to collaborate with Hamas. This is not just the EU. There's few players working on this. If you've been following the Palestinian press, we know the Saudi Arabia has been mentioned. The Egyptians have been mentioned, Qataris have been mentioned, the Turkish have been mentioned, and the now former head of the UN Special Coordination for the Middle East, Robert Seri, this was his last proposal that he was pushing in the few weeks before he left his post. So we definitely are going to see more of this. We're going to see the international community trying to broker this deal. What are the chances? My prediction is that this is not going to be as easy as it sounds, not because there is no will between, not just because this at this point, this is not just because Israel, this is not between Israel and Hamas, this is between Israel, Hamas, the PA, and let's not forget Egypt. If I'm talking about how is the international community affecting the question of Palestine, I cannot ignore Egypt, which is the big elephant in the room here, meaning that at this point in time, another big player in this context is the Egyptians. There is no question that after the changing government, in the summer of 2013, the relationship between Hamas and the Egyptian government have gone sour, but things have gone even more sour after the last round of war. And you know that from an Egyptian perspective, there is nothing that they see weakening Hamas in Gaza as another way to carry out their national agenda, which has to do with weakening any type of Islamist opposition. Hamas is seen as an extension of that, and that is why if you see what Egypt has been doing since August 2014, it is pressure and more pressure on Hamas by closing or heavily restricting the crossings. Rafah used to be the main exit point before 2013. You had about 20,000 people exiting Gaza through Rafah every month. The number is now negligible. It's more days that it's closed than it's open. So the border has been pretty much restricted. There is a buffer zone being built, which is going to make it even harder for crossing of goods on people. And then the main story about Egypt and Hamas is not the crossings, let's be honest, it's the tunnels. Because when we focus on how many truckloads get in and out of Gaza through Rafah or through Keren HaShalom, we forget that before 2013, 3/4 was actually getting in Gaza through tunnels. So blocking the tunnels is the main pressure on Hamas. And I don't think any moving ahead on Gaza will actually come to fruition without getting Egypt heavily involved in the process. And so with that notion, the international community, again, from Brussels or from Washington, has a bind in which carrying forward their political agenda cannot be done without regional involvement, cannot be done without getting the PA to collaborate, without getting Egypt to collaborate, and without getting an understanding with Hamas. None of these are easy, but these are going to be the priorities. And then in my last 5 minutes, I'll tell you why these are the priorities and why I'm spending most of my time talking about Gaza. And that is because when I think about how much is Brussels or DC going to do about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process? Well, here I go back to my first point. There is disillusionment, there is frustration, there is definitely a perception after this last round of elections that the window, the possibilities of a deal are not great. They're actually quite abysmal, to be honest. So that's why that's going to be only a secondary effort. What the EU is going to do in the next few months is, however, trying, as they see it, and I'm presenting it from their perspective, to do what they can to strengthen the two-state solution. And that's going to mean, first of all, investing in supporting the Palestinian efforts in the international arena. You heard in the past few days about the Vatican, de facto recognition of Palestine as a state. That's not an exception, that's becoming the rule. Since the UN General Assembly voted on this in 2012, we have had a number of states. Sweden last November became the second. People said it was the first European state because they didn't think about Iceland, which actually was the first, but it's too small to count, I suppose. So Sweden was the first big European country to recognize Palestine, but it was the 135th country in the world to recognize Palestine. So now countries not recognize Palestine are a minority in the world for sure, and they're becoming more and more a minority also in Europe. And in the past few months, we probably see this gap closed. At the moment, you know, you have all the big EU5 minus Germany recognizing Palestine. So that's a trend. The second trend is going to be about pushing for supporting, again, I'm presenting it from the European perspective, supporting the two-state solution by trying to increase the cost of maintaining the status quo, and that is going to be result in a push for greater sanctions is not really the right word because it's probably an overstatement when it has been done, but increase penalization of Israeli goods produced across the Green Line. We all know that the guidelines were put out in the summer of 2013, but so far not much has happened. There's been a few things happening. For example, poultry produced in the West Bank had problems being exported to Europe because it was certified by veterinarians in the West Bank, which now the EU doesn't recognize anymore. So yes, there has been a few things, but nothing that you can say has had a massive impact on the economy. However, politically, I think the story is we're going to see more of this. Last week, we had a letter signed by 16 out of the 28 EU foreign ministers to Federica Mogherini, to the EU High Representative, asking Federica Mogherini to take ahead the issue of labeling. So labeling West Bank goods as such, something that Cathy Ashton has been asked to do a year before. But back then, Secretary Kerry asked her to hold off because he said, we want to give negotiations a chance. I don't think that's not going to play today. Today there is no Secretary Kerry saying to hold off on negotiations, and the EU biggest countries have been sponsoring this proposal, everybody but Germany. So because of that, I think that's going to be also going back on the agenda, and with that I'm going to close because I have 1 minute. And it's going to be likely be discussing Mogherini's next trip to Israel and Palestine in the next few months. So where do we stand? Is this going to make a big difference? That's a whole new lecture, which I'm not going to get to, but to give you a 10-second snapshot, yes and no. Economically, not so much. Politically, yes, there is a trend that I think if I was in the Israeli government, which I'm not, I would pay close attention to because I think it is going to pick up, especially after the last elections. But in general, seen from the international community's point of view, Israeli-Palestinian process will continue to be high on the rhetoric. When it comes to actual expectation that something will come out of it, I don't think those are very high, and that is why we're seeing more investments in Gaza, and that's why we're seeing more investment in keeping the PA going economically. And again, that's very important. Sometimes we forget that had it not been for this massive injection of cash and support that the international community is putting into the PA, the situation will be far worse than what it is, also in terms of its local legitimacy. So that reflects an international concern, but at the same time, I think the international community is well aware of what we all know by living here, which is at the end of the day, without getting the local actors to take a leading role, nothing is going to go forward. With that happy note, I conclude.